There's a place in northern Pennsylvania where the trees grow too close together, where the undergrowth never quite dies, even in winter, where local contractors still refuse to dig foundation holes without calling the county first, not because of utility lines, because of what they keep finding 6 feet down. The locals don't talk about it with outsiders. They've learned that silence is a form of protection. But if you sit long enough in the right diner, nurse the right cup of coffee, and know how to listen without asking, someone will eventually tell you about the Marchwood family. And once they start talking, they can't seem to stop, as if the story itself has been waiting decades for someone willing to hear it. In 1974, a surveying crew was mapping property lines for a planned housing development. Standard work, routine measurements, until their ground-penetrating radar started showing anomalies. Dozens of them, scattered across what had once been private land belonging to a family that had lived there since the 1880s. The crew supervisor made the call. Within hours, the site was cordoned off. Within days, the state police had brought in cadaver dogs and forensic teams. What they unearthed that autumn didn't make the national news. It barely made the local papers. A few brief mentions, vague language. Human remains discovered. Investigation ongoing. Then, nothing. The housing development was quietly cancelled. The land was purchased by an entity whose ownership documents looped through 3 shell companies, and the Marchwood name disappeared from county records as if it had never existed. But here's what they don't tell you in the sanitized versions of history. Here's what gets left out when a story is too disturbing for comfortable digestion. The forensic team didn't find a burial ground. They found something that suggested systematic concealment over multiple generations. And the remains, they weren't just bodies. They were evidence of something that had been happening in those woods for longer than anyone wanted to calculate. This is the story of what happens when a family's darkest compulsions become its inheritance. When silence becomes collaboration, when blood doesn't just tie you together, it drowns you in what came before. The woods remember, even when the living choose to forget. The Marchwood family arrived in Pennsylvania in 1883. German immigrants, skilled craftsmen. The kind of people who built their own homes with their own hands and asked nothing from their neighbors except to be left alone. And their neighbors were happy to oblige. Because even then, there was something about the Marchwoods that made people uneasy. Wilhelm Marchwood purchased 240 acres of dense woodland for almost nothing. Land nobody else wanted. Too remote, too difficult to farm, too dark, some said, though they couldn't quite explain what they meant by that. Wilhelm built a house deep in the center of the property. Then he built a barn. Then he built something else, a structure the county assessor's records describe only as outbuilding. Stone construction, no windows. By 1890, Wilhelm had married. His wife Anna came from another German immigrant family 2 counties over. They had children, 6 of them, according to census records. But here's where the documentation becomes strange. The 1900 census lists 6 children. The 1910 census lists 4, not because 2 had died. There are no death certificates. They simply vanish from the official record as if they'd never existed at all. When Wilhelm died in 1912, his eldest son Friedrich took over the property. Friedrich also married, also had children, and once again the census numbers don't add up. Children appear, then disappear. No obituaries, no graves in the local cemetery, just absences that no one seemed to question. Or perhaps they questioned them quietly, in their own homes, and then decided it was safer not to ask out loud. By the 1940s, the Marchwoods had become something of a local legend. Stories circulated, strange noises from the property at night, livestock that would bolt and refuse to graze near the property line, a mailman who quit his route after delivering to the Marchwood house, though he would never explain why. Just said he wouldn't go back, not for any amount of money. But legends are easy to dismiss. Superstition, rural paranoia, the kind of stories people tell to make their boring lives more interesting, except sometimes legends exist because people don't know how else to speak about what they've witnessed. When the truth is too disturbing to name directly, we wrap it in folklore. We make it fantastical so we don't have to admit it's real. The last registered Marchwood was Theodore, born 1931, lived alone on the property after his parents died in the early 1950s, never married, never had visitors that anyone saw, kept to himself for more than 2 decades, until one morning in 1973, a utility worker noticed the mailbox overflowing, the grass overgrown, no smoke from the chimney despite the autumn cold. Theodore Marchwood was found dead inside the house. Natural causes, the coroner said, heart failure. He was 42 years old. And that should have been the end of the Marchwood story. An isolated family line extinct, their land reverting to the state. Except someone had to survey that land before it could be sold. Someone had to walk those woods and map what was there. And that's when they found the door. It wasn't hidden. That's what disturbed the surveying crew most. The door was right there, set into the hillside like it had been waiting to be found. Heavy timber frame, iron hinges so old they'd fused with rust, and above the entrance, carved directly into the stone lintel, a single word in German: vergessen, forgotten. The crew supervisor radioed back to the county office, asked what they should do. The answer came back within minutes: do not enter, mark the location, return to base. By the next morning, state police had secured the site. By that afternoon, they'd brought in cutting equipment to breach the door, and by evening, they'd called in the FBI. What they found inside wasn't a root cellar. It wasn't storage. It was a descending stone staircase, hand-carved, leading down into bedrock, 23 steps. The air coming up from below was cold and stale, and carried a smell that made grown men gag through their respirators. One of the officers would later tell a reporter, off the record, that it smelled like time itself had rotted down there. The chamber at the bottom was roughly 30 feet across, stone walls, stone floor, and along those walls, shelving, dozens of wooden shelves meticulously constructed, and on those shelves, arranged with disturbing care, were containers, glass jars, metal boxes, wooden crates with German words burned into the lids, each one labeled, each one dated, some going back to the 1880s. The forensic team spent 6 days cataloging what they found. They worked in shifts because no one could stay down there for more than an hour without becoming physically ill. Not from the smell alone, from the realization of what they were documenting. Because those containers, they held pieces, remains that had been preserved, sorted, and stored like specimens in a museum of atrocity, bone fragments labeled by size, teeth separated into jars by apparent age, fabric swatches that DNA testing would later confirm contained blood from multiple individuals. Journals written in German filled with dates and measurements and observations recorded in handwriting that remained steady and precise across decades. Multiple handwriting styles, multiple generations, documenting the same practices their fathers and grandfathers had maintained. The FBI sealed the site. The contents were removed under federal jurisdiction. The chamber was filled with concrete. The entrance was bulldozed and buried under 6 feet of earth and gravel. And then the silence began, the official silence. The kind that governments impose when the truth serves no purpose except to horrify. No press conference, no public statement. Just a few lines in the county records about historical remains being transferred to appropriate facilities for analysis. The families who'd been waiting for the housing development received form letters explaining the project had been cancelled due to unforeseen complications. No details, no explanations, just bureaucratic language designed to end conversation before it could begin. But here's what we know from the forensic reports that eventually leaked, from the investigators who couldn't carry what they'd seen alone and spoke to journalists decades later, after retirement, after the nightmares had finally faded enough to function. The remains found in that chamber represented at least 47 individuals, men, women, children. Some of the remains dated back more than 80 years, and the preservation techniques. They suggested this wasn't random violence. This was methodology. This was ritual practiced with the dedication of craft. The Marchwoods hadn't just killed, they'd kept. The journals were the worst part. That's what the forensic psychologist said when she was finally willing to talk about it, 30 years later, after she'd retired. After the case had officially been closed and the files buried in federal archives where they'd likely remain forever. She said the physical remains were horrific, yes, but the journals revealed something that human beings aren't supposed to know about each other. They were written in Old German dialect, formal, meticulous. The earliest entries dated to 1884, just a year after Wilhelm Marchwood purchased the land, and they read like a farmer's log: dates, weather conditions, observations about growth and yield. Except they weren't documenting crops, they were documenting people. Wilhelm wrote about specimens, the way a biologist might describe research subjects: age, physical condition, behavioral characteristics. He recorded how long each one lasted, what methods proved most effective, what mistakes he'd made and how he'd corrected them, and then lessons for whoever came after him, instructions, refinements. He was passing down knowledge the way a blacksmith teaches his son to work iron. Friedrich's entries began in 1895, when he was 17 years old. His father was teaching him, training him, and Friedrich wrote about this education with something approaching pride. He described his first time assisting his father, his nervousness, his father's patience, and then, years later, Friedrich documented teaching his own son the same way, the same patience, the same methodical instruction. 3 generations of horror, preserved in careful handwriting. But here's what made it unbearable for the investigators. The journals didn't read like the writings of madmen. There was no raving, no grandiosity, no delusion, just calm observation, problem solving, the tone you'd use to describe fixing a fence or preparing soil for planting. The banality of it was more disturbing than any amount of theatrical evil could have been, because it revealed that human beings can normalize anything, can make routine out of atrocity, can pass down monstrosity like it's tradition. Theodore's entries were the last. They ran from 1949 to 1972, and his writing showed something different. Hesitation, doubt, long gaps between entries where his father and grandfather had written consistently. In his final entries, Theodore wrote about being alone, about the weight of maintaining what his family had built, about wondering if anyone would understand what they'd accomplished. And in his very last entry, dated just weeks before his death, he wrote something that still haunts everyone who read it. The collection is complete. Let those who find it judge whether we were artists or demons. We were neither. We were simply Marchwoods. The FBI brought in linguistic experts, psychologists, historians, trying to understand what would drive a family to do this across generations. Was it mental illness passed genetically? Was it cult behavior, some twisted interpretation of their German heritage? And the conclusion they reached was somehow worse than any dramatic explanation. There was no grand reason, no ideology, no psychotic break, just a family that had decided somewhere in the 1880s that this was what they would do, and then they did it, for 90 years. The question that kept circling back was, where did the victims come from? 47 people over nearly a century. That's one person every 2 years on average. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to trigger patterns. Transients, the investigators theorized. Drifters passing through, people who wouldn't be missed, runaways, the vulnerable, the invisible, the people society had already forgotten, taken by a family who made forgetting permanent. Local police records from the 1890s through the 1970s showed dozens of missing person reports that were never solved, logged, filed, forgotten. Because in rural America, people disappeared all the time. Economic migration, family disputes, personal choice. No one questioned it. No one connected the disappearances to the quiet family in the woods who kept to themselves and bothered no one. That's how this happened. Not through dramatic evil, through quiet persistence, through a family that understood the most powerful weapon isn't violence. It's the fact that most people don't want to look too closely at what makes them uncomfortable. There's a photograph that exists in the FBI case file, only one, taken in 1967 by a freelance photographer who was documenting rural Pennsylvania for a magazine article that never got published. He was driving past the Marchwood property when he saw Theodore standing at the property line. Just standing there, staring at the road. The photographer stopped and asked if he could take a picture. Theodore didn't say yes, didn't say no, just kept staring. So the photographer took the shot and drove away. He said later that something about Theodore's eyes had stayed with him. Not because they were wild or deranged, because they were empty. Like looking at someone who'd hollowed himself out and was just operating the remaining machinery. When the FBI showed him the photograph years later during the investigation, the photographer started crying, said he'd driven past a man who was living in a museum of death, and he'd just taken a picture and left. Like Theodore was architecture, like he wasn't a human being who might have been screaming for help in the only way he knew how, by standing at the edge of his property and letting himself be seen. But here's the question no one wants to ask. The question that the investigators whispered about but never put in their official reports. What if Theodore wanted to stop? What if he'd spent his entire life trying to figure out how to break a cycle he'd been born into? His journal entries show doubt, show isolation, show a man who was carrying something he didn't know how to put down. And when he died alone in that house, was that surrender, or was that the only escape he could imagine? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you'd been born into a legacy of horror, raised to see it as normal, taught by people who loved you that this was your inheritance, do you become the one who stops it? Or does the weight of family loyalty, of tradition, of everything you've ever known, do those things become chains you can't break even when you know they're wrong? The FBI closed the case in 1976. Officially, they concluded the Marchwood family had engaged in serial murder across multiple generations. They documented what they could. They buried what they couldn't explain. And they made a decision that still divides law enforcement ethicists today. They chose not to go public with the full details. They reasoned that the victims had no living families to notify, that the perpetrators were all dead, that releasing the information would serve no purpose except to traumatize a community and sensationalize horror. But there were investigators who disagreed, who believed the public had a right to know what had happened on that land, who argued that silence was complicity, that by burying the truth, the government was doing exactly what the Marchwood family had done, choosing to forget rather than confront what was too disturbing to acknowledge. One retired FBI agent said it best in a 2003 interview that was recorded but never aired. He said, "We tell ourselves we're protecting people by not telling them the truth, but what we're really protecting is our own comfort. Because if we admit that a family can do what the Marchwoods did for that long without anyone noticing or caring, then we have to admit that our entire social structure is built on not looking too closely at the people we'd rather ignore, and that's a mirror nobody wants to stand in front of." The land where the Marchwood house stood is still there. Overgrown now. The structures have been demolished, the chamber filled and buried. But if you know where to look, you can still find the foundation stones, still see where the property line runs. And if you're there at dusk when the light fails and the woods grow dark, local people say you can still hear it. Not screaming, not anything dramatic, just silence, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on you, that makes you understand why nothing will grow there anymore. In 1978, a graduate student in forensic anthropology requested access to the Marchwood case files for her dissertation. She wanted to study the preservation methods used by the family, the psychological implications of multi-generational participation in serial violence, the sociology of how communities fail to recognize patterns hidden in plain sight. Her request was denied. No explanation given, just a form letter stating the materials were classified under federal seal. She tried again in 1982. Denied, she reached out to the lead investigators. Most wouldn't return her calls. One finally agreed to meet her at a diner far from where he lived. He told her to stop looking, said it wasn't a threat, it was advice. He said some knowledge doesn't advance understanding, it just spreads damage. And the Marchwood case was contagious in ways the FBI was still trying to contain. Because here's what they'd discovered in those journals that they didn't know how to process. The Marchwoods had been writing to someone, not just documenting for themselves. Wilhelm's earliest entries addressed those who will continue the work. Friedrich wrote about maintaining the tradition for future keepers. Theodore, in his isolation, still wrote as if someone would eventually read and understand. They believed they were part of something larger than their family, part of a practice that extended beyond their property line. The FBI quietly investigated whether there were other families, other properties, other chambers hidden in rural America where silence was easier than scrutiny. They found suggestions, patterns that could have been coincidences. Missing person clusters near isolated properties owned by families who'd been there for generations. Unexplained construction on land that had never been fully surveyed. But nothing concrete, nothing provable. Just enough to make them wonder if the Marchwoods were unique, or if they were just the only ones who'd been found. That uncertainty was worse than confirmation, because it meant that every isolated property, every family that kept to themselves, every patch of woods where the undergrowth grew too thick, any of them could be hiding the same thing, and there was no way to know without digging, without violating property rights and privacy on nothing but suspicion. So they made a choice. They decided to stop looking. The graduate student eventually gave up her research, went into a different field entirely. But years later she told an interviewer that the case had changed how she saw the world. She said she used to believe that evil was rare, that it required extraordinary circumstances, that normal people, in normal families, would never participate in sustained atrocity. And then she'd encountered the Marchwood journals, encountered evidence that human beings could normalize anything if it was introduced gradually enough, if it was framed as family duty, if it was maintained with enough mundane consistency that it stopped feeling exceptional. She said the most disturbing thing wasn't the violence itself, it was the realization that the Marchwoods probably loved each other, probably had normal conversations over dinner, probably celebrated birthdays and holidays, probably comforted each other during illness and mourned each other in death. They were a family. They just happened to be a family that also maintained a chamber of preserved human remains and passed down the methodology like any other inheritance. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold in your mind the fact that love and horror can coexist in the same people, the same home, the same bloodline? That's the question that haunted the investigators. That's what made some of them leave law enforcement entirely. Because once you understand that human beings contain multitudes, that someone can be both a devoted father and a meticulous killer, both a loving son and an accomplice to generational murder, then every certainty you had about human nature starts to dissolve. The Marchwood family weren't monsters. That's the truth that no one wants to accept. Monsters would be easier. Monsters are other. Monsters are separate from us. But the Marchwoods were just people. People who made choices. People who taught their children that those choices were normal. People who built a legacy out of the fundamental human capacity to adapt, to rationalize, to continue doing what we've always done because that's how it's always been done. And that capacity exists in all of us. That's the real horror. Not that the Marchwoods existed, but that they prove how easily human beings can make the unthinkable routine.